There is a photograph of Rue Saint-Paul in Old Montreal, taken sometime in the early 1870s. In it, you can see a street in transition. On the left side of the frame, a row of stone commercial buildings sits at one level, their ground floor windows looking directly out onto the road, their front steps descending to the original pavement surface. On the right side of the same street, the buildings are different. Their ground floor windows are half buried. Their front entrances have been replaced by new doors cut into what used to be the second floor. Wooden stairs, temporary and makeshift, connect the new doors to the raised road surface in front of them, and the road surface itself is visibly higher on the right side than on the left, the difference in elevation between the two sides of the same street, marked by a sloped transition zone of packed earth and gravel. You're looking at a city in the middle of raising itself, not a small adjustment, not a cosmetic resurfacing, a systematic, block by block, decade by decade project to lift the entire lower city of Montreal out of its original position on the floodplain of the St. Lawrence River and set it down again 12 feet higher. An operation so large in scale and so gradual in execution that it did not feel, to the people living through it, like a single project at all. It felt like construction, like repair, like the ordinary, grinding, inconvenient business of a city growing into itself. But something specific happened beneath those streets as the fill went in, something that nobody planned for, that nobody was thinking about, and that the city of Montreal would not fully reckon with for another 100 years. As the new street surface rose to its final position 12 feet above the original ground level, everything beneath it was sealed. The buildings whose ground floors had been abandoned, the cellars that had been bricked over, the stone foundations of structures demolished a century before, the channels of rivers that had been culverted and covered, the walls of a colonial fortress that had been torn down and forgotten, 3.5 centuries of urban material, the daily debris, and the grand infrastructure and the personal objects of the people who built the oldest major European settlement west of Quebec City, was enclosed beneath a cap of fill and gravel and cobblestone, and the city walked above it and forgot it was there. 80% of the buried archaeological resource beneath Old Montreal has never been excavated, not studied inadequately, not partially investigated and then abandoned, never touched, never opened. The objects that were in the cellars of buildings demolished in 1840 are still in those cellars. The leather and bone and glass and ceramic of 3 centuries of ordinary colonial life is still in the fill and in the occupation layers beneath the fill, sitting in conditions of preservation, ranging from good to extraordinary, waiting in the dark beneath a neighborhood that receives several million visitors a year and is discussed in virtually every account of Canadian history. What is beneath the current road has never been shown, not because it was lost or destroyed, because it was sealed and the seal has barely been broken. This is the story of how that happened. Before you go any further, if this kind of buried history is the reason you watch videos on this channel, subscribe now. New research, new buried places, new forgotten layers of history go up regularly. The algorithm will bury this video if you do not engage with it, which is, given the subject matter, almost appropriate. Subscribe, and stay until the end because the final section of this video contains something that I think is the most significant unanswered question in the entire history of this city. Number 1. The river that wanted the city back. The island of Montreal sits in the middle of the St. Lawrence River at approximately the point where the river, widening as it moves northeast from the Great Lakes Basin, briefly narrows again before opening into the broad estuary that carries it toward the Atlantic. The island itself is roughly 32 miles long and 10 miles wide at its widest point, shaped by the river that surrounds it, elevated in its center by the ancient volcanic intrusion of Montreal and sloping toward flatness at both its eastern and western ends where the river comes closest to its surface. The lower city of what would become Montreal, the area now called Old Montreal, sits at the southwestern edge of the island, on a flat terrace above the St. Lawrence, that is, at its lowest point, only marginally above the ordinary flood level of the river in spring. This was not an accident of settlement. The founders of Ville Marie in 1642 chose this ground deliberately, for exactly the reasons that any settlement would choose a flat riverside terrace with access to navigable water and proximity to the fur trade networks that the St. Lawrence enabled. The ground was good enough. The access was excellent. The flooding was a problem that could be managed. The flooding was never fully managed. It was accommodated, worked around, cursed at, built above, and eventually used as the justification for the largest single infrastructure project in the history of the colonial city. But it was not solved, and the river's seasonal assertion of its prior claim to this ground was a constant feature of life in the lower city for 2.5 centuries, before the raising project finally moved the street level above the reach of ordinary flood events. The St. Lawrence is not a gentle river. Its spring flow, fed by snowmelt from the entire Great Lakes Basin and the Ottawa River system and the tributaries of the upper St. Lawrence itself, can raise the river level by 8 to 10 feet above its summer level in a matter of weeks. At Ville Marie in 1642, a spring flood could cover the lower terraces of the settlement's chosen ground entirely, turning the flat land near the water into a shallow lake for days or weeks at a time. The settlers who arrived with Paul de Chomedey de Maisonneuve in the late spring of that year had barely established their first structures when the river demonstrated what it intended to do with their new home. The flood of 1642, which arrived within months of the founding of the settlement, was severe enough that Maisonneuve made a public vow that if the settlement survived without loss of life, he would personally carry a cross to the summit of Montreal and plant it there. The settlement survived. The cross went up. The flooding continued every spring for the next 200 years. What the river deposited on the low ground when it flooded was not only water, it was silt, fine gray clay carried from upstream and left behind as the floodwater receded. This silt accumulated on the surface of the settlement's lower reaches year by year, gradually raising the effective ground level by fractions of an inch per flood event. It was the river doing its own slow version of what the city would later do, deliberately and dramatically, building up the surface of the floodplain with deposited material. The silt, layers from successive flood events, are visible in archaeological excavations in Old Montreal as thin gray lenses within the general occupation deposit, markers of each year the river took back what the city had tried to claim. The river shaped the buried record of Old Montreal before the first Europeans saw the island. It has been shaping it ever since. Number 2. What the founding generation actually built. The common image of the founding of Ville Marie in 1642 is a scene of arrival and declaration. A small group of colonists, 53 people in the first wave, landing on the shore, a cross being erected, prayers being said, a city beginning. What the image leaves out is the extraordinary difficulty of what came next, which was the problem of building a permanent, functional settlement in a place that the continent's largest river was actively trying to take back every spring. The first buildings of Ville Marie were wood. They had to be. Stone construction in an early colonial settlement required quarried and dressed stone, skilled masons, lime for mortar, and the logistical infrastructure to supply all of those things to a remote location in sufficient quantities to build more than a few walls. The colonists had none of this at first. What they had was standing timber in quantities beyond anything they had known in France, the dense mixed hardwood and softwood forest of the island, and the tools and skills to cut it and shape it into buildings. The wooden buildings of early Ville Marie were built on the French vernacular pattern, timber frames with wooden sheathing, chinked against the drafts of a continental winter with whatever material was available, roofed with wooden shingles split from local cedar. They sat on stone foundation walls where stone was accessible, on wooden sill plates laid directly on the ground where it was not. Their floors were earth in the simplest structures, plank in the better ones. Their windows were small, covered with oiled cloth or thin scraped animal membrane in the early years before glass became reliably available. Beneath many of these early buildings, the colonists dug cellars. A cellar in a 17th century building was not a luxury feature. It was a functional necessity, a storage space that maintained temperatures below freezing in winter and cool in summer, protecting the provisions on which the settlement's survival depended. Root vegetables, dried meat, salted fish, preserved fruits, imported provisions from France. All of these required cool and stable storage conditions that a ground-level room in a wooden building in the St. Lawrence Valley could not provide. The cellars were dug by hand into the local soil, typically to a depth of 4 to 6 feet below floor level. The walls were stone-lined where possible, the stone mortared or dry-laid depending on the skill of the builder and the resources available. The floor was usually packed earth. Access was typically by a wooden trapdoor in the floor of the building above, reached by a steep wooden stair or a simple ladder. These cellars are the oldest surviving built features beneath Old Montreal. The buildings above them burned or were demolished decades or centuries ago. The cellar walls, embedded in the earth, survived. Archaeologists working at depths of 12 to 15 feet below the modern street surface have found cellar features that date to the first generation of European settlement on the island, stone-lined cavities in the earth that have been sealed since the late 17th or early 18th century. Their contents, if any contents remained when they were sealed, preserved in the dark and the damp. The oldest Montreal you can still touch is not above the ground. It never was. Number 3, the three fires and the ground they made. Montreal burned in 1721. It burned again in 1734. It burned a third time in 1765. These three fires are the most significant single events in the physical formation of the buried archaeological record beneath Old Montreal, not because they destroyed the city, though they did significant damage each time, but because of what happened after them. Each fire left a layer of destruction in the earth. Each rebuilding sealed that layer beneath a new surface. And each cycle of destruction and rebuilding raised the effective ground level of the city by a fraction of a foot, accumulating across three events into a measurable and archaeologically significant elevation gain that would eventually contribute to the problem the raising project was designed to solve. The 1721 fire broke out on a June afternoon in the lower town. The accounts differ on its precise origin, but agree on its character. A fast-moving fire in a district of closely packed wooden buildings with inadequate water supply for suppression. It burned a significant portion of the commercial district before it could be contained. The debris, collapsed walls and charred roof timbers, and the burned remains of the goods stored in the affected buildings was not removed from the site in any systematic way. The practical logic of reconstruction in a colonial city with limited labor was to level what could be leveled, clear away the worst of the material, and build the new structures on a surface that incorporated the rubble of the old. This means that somewhere beneath the current surface of Old Montreal, at a depth consistent with the 1721 event, there is a charcoal layer, a thin but continuous horizon of burned material running through the soil across the area affected by the fire, dark against the lighter occupation, deposits above and below it. Archaeologists call these features fire horizons, and they are among the most useful features in an urban archaeological sequence because they provide a fixed chronological reference point within the stratigraphy. Material below a fire horizon dates before the fire. Material above it dates after. The horizon itself can often be dated precisely using documentary records of when the fire occurred. The 1734 fire was larger than the 1721 event and more damaging in its effects on the institutional fabric of the city. The hospital general was severely damaged. The convent of the Grey Nuns suffered structural losses that required years to repair. A substantial section of the residential and commercial lower town was destroyed. The rebuilding that followed this fire was the occasion for stricter building regulations, requiring stone construction in the most densely affected areas and mandating fire-resistant party walls between adjacent structures. The stone buildings that replaced the destroyed wooden ones were more durable, more expensive to build, and generated significantly more rubble when they were eventually demolished. The 1765 fire occurred only 2 years after the end of the 7 Years' War and the formal transfer of New France from French to British administration. Montreal, in 1765, was a city in political transition, its French colonial elite attempting to maintain their commercial position under British rule, new British merchants establishing themselves in the fur trade, the institutional landscape of the colony being reconstructed under a different imperial power. A fire in this context was more than a physical event. It was an opportunity for the reallocation of urban property in a city where ownership and legal status were being renegotiated at every level. The rebuilding after 1765 was the rebuilding of a British colonial city on the foundations of a French one. The new buildings reflected different architectural traditions in their proportions and details, though the local limestone that had been the dominant building material in French Montreal continued to be used, because the rock of the Montreal area was what was available, and the physics of building with it did not change with the nationality of the occupants. But the configuration of properties changed, and the institutions that occupied the rebuilt district changed, and what went into the ground as fill and foundation rubble in the rebuilding of the post-1765 lower city contains a mixed material record. French artifacts in the lower deposits, British artifacts in the upper deposits, the physical trace of a colonial transfer of power sitting 12 feet below a cobblestone street. The three fires together created three distinct charcoal horizons within the buried stratigraphy of old Montreal. They also, through the repeated cycle of collapse and rebuilding, contributed to the progressive elevation of the settlement's ground surface. Each demolition left rubble that became the foundation for the next construction. Each new floor surface was laid slightly higher than its predecessor. By the time the systematic street raising project began in the early 19th century, the lower town had already been building up its own surface for 150 years through the organic accumulation of disaster and response. Number 4, the mathematics of fill. Let us be precise about the numbers, because the numbers are the thing that makes this story almost impossible to visualize until you work through them slowly. The street raising project in Old Montreal, which proceeded incrementally across roughly the period from 1815 to 1885, raised the average surface level of the lower city by approximately 10 to 12 feet. In some locations it was less. In the deepest areas of the original flood zone, closer to the St. Pierre River and the St. Lawrence shoreline, it was more. 12 feet is the number that appears most consistently in the historical and archaeological literature, and it is the number we will use. 12 feet of fill across the footprint of the lower city represents an almost incomprehensible volume of material. Old Montreal, the area bounded roughly by the former line of the fortification walls, covers approximately 1 square kilometer of surface area. A 1 square kilometer area raised by 12 feet requires approximately 12 million cubic feet of fill material. That is roughly 450,000 cubic meters. That is approximately 900,000 tons of material, assuming an average fill density similar to compacted earth and rubble. which is a rough estimate but a useful one. In the early 19th century, before the mechanization of excavation and transport, this material was moved almost entirely by human and animal labor. Wheelbarrows, horse-drawn carts, and hand shovels were the primary equipment. A skilled laborer with a wheelbarrow and a cart team could move perhaps 20 to 30 cubic meters of material per day under good conditions. To move 450,000 cubic meters at that rate would require at minimum several thousand worker years of labor distributed across the 7 decades of the project. Most of this labor was performed by Irish immigrants, particularly those who arrived in the waves of immigration driven by the Great Famine of the 1840s and the preceding years of agricultural distress. The Irish immigrants who came to Montreal in the 1830s and 1840s entered a labor market that offered work in construction and infrastructure for people with strong backs and no specific skills. They dug the sewers. They spread the fill. They laid the cobblestones. The raising of the streets of old Montreal was, in a very direct physical sense, built by the most desperate and dispossessed people that 19th century Atlantic migration produced. They left no record of this work in anything approaching a personal account. The foremen who supervised them appear occasionally in municipal records. The contractors who employed the foremen are somewhat better documented. The workers themselves exist in the historical record primarily as statistics, as aggregate numbers in immigration tallies, and in the grim mortality tables of the typhus epidemic of 1847, which killed a proportion of the Irish immigrant population of Montreal that is still difficult to read without a physical reaction. The fill material itself came from several sources. The excavation of new sewers and building foundations generated enormous quantities of earth that had to go somewhere. The demolition of buildings in the areas being redeveloped produced rubble, broken stone and brick and mortar that was incorporated into the road base. The dredging of the St. Lawrence Harbor produced silt and gravel that was used in some areas. River gravel from the banks of the island was carted to the lower city. The fill is therefore not a homogeneous material, but a mixture of substances that reflects the sources available at different times and locations. And archaeologists working in the fill layers can sometimes identify the origin of specific fill components from the character of the material. What the fill also contains, unintentionally and in no systematic way, is artifacts. Objects that were in the buildings demolished for rubble, or in the soil of sites being excavated for new foundations, or in the river gravel being carted from the banks, were incorporated into the fill along with the building material. These displaced artifacts, found in contexts that do not represent their original place of use, are one of the interpretive challenges of urban archaeology in Old Montreal. A 17th century pipe bowl found in a 19th century fill deposit tells you only that the pipe bowl existed somewhere in the city before the fill was placed. It does not tell you where it was used or by whom. The fill has mixed the material record in ways that are important to understand and difficult to fully account for. Number 5. How a building becomes a basement. The transformation of a building's ground floor into a subgrade basement is a process that sounds simple in description and is genuinely strange in practice. Consider what it actually means for a person who occupied a ground floor commercial space in the lower town of Montreal in 1845. Your shop has a front door that opens directly onto the street. Your display window is at eye level for anyone walking past. Your customers enter, browse, make their purchases, and leave at the same grade as the pavement outside. Your building has a cellar below your shop floor, used for storage, accessible by a trap door and a ladder. Your shop floor is the bottom of your functional world. Over the course of the next several years, the street in front of your building rises. It does not rise dramatically or all at once. It rises in stages as roadwork crews add material to the roadbed, as new sewer work requires the excavation and backfill of sections of the street as neighboring property owners modify their own facades and the transitions between properties shift. Each time you look out your window, the street is slightly higher than it was before. Each time a new batch of fill goes down, the bottom of your display window is slightly more obscured. By the time the street has risen 4 feet, your ground floor window is half buried. A customer walking past looks down into your shop rather than across at it. Your front step, which used to bring customers up 1 step to your door level, now requires them to descend 2 steps from the street to reach your entrance. The light in your shop is reduced by roughly half. The visual connection between your merchandise and the passing trade is severely compromised. By the time the street has risen 8 feet, your shop is effectively underground. The window, if it has not been bricked over, looks out into a slot of light between the building wall and the face of the road fill, a narrow channel that admits a gray and indirect illumination. The street entrance to your building is now 8 feet above your floor, requiring a wooden bridge or a very long stair to connect the two. At this point, most property owners have made a decision. They have either modified their building, cutting new openings at the new street level in the upper portion of their facade, or they have abandoned the ground floor entirely, closed it off, and operated their business from what used to be the second floor, which is now the first floor. The space that used to be your shop is now sealed. The inventory that was too difficult to move went with the closing. The furniture that was not worth selling was left in place. The shelving on the walls, built into the stone of the building, was too solidly attached to be worth removing. The floor surface, stone or packed earth or wide plank, remains as it was. The door and window frames, now opening onto fill material, were sealed with rubble and mortar. Dirt was packed against the outside face of the building to support the road fill. And then new cobblestones went down, and new traffic began to move above the sealed space, and the shop became a void. These sealed former commercial spaces are among the most archaeologically significant features of the buried city. Because they were closed off rapidly without the systematic clearing that would accompany a deliberate abandonment, they preserve something close to a snapshot of their condition at the moment of sealing. The objects on the shelves stayed on the shelves until gravity eventually brought them down. The material swept into corners stayed in corners. The accumulated organic debris of a working commercial space, sawdust and animal hair and food scraps and textile fragments and broken ceramics, stayed exactly where it was. Nobody has been in these spaces since they were sealed. In some cases, the sealing happened 160 years ago. In others, closer to 180. The physics of preservation in sealed, subgrade spaces, where moisture and temperature are relatively stable and oxygen is limited, means that organic material that would decay completely in an open, aerated environment can survive in a recognizable or even intact condition. Leather, wood, textile, bone, organic residues on ceramic vessels that can be analyzed for their chemical composition to determine what was stored in them. All of this is in there. The sealed former ground floors of old Montreal's commercial buildings are not a theoretical possibility. They are a confirmed archaeological reality. Excavations that have reached the appropriate depth in appropriate locations have found them. Their contents have been documented and removed for analysis. The question is not whether they exist, but how many there are, in what condition, and when the city will systematically investigate them before a development project eliminates them without documentation. Number 6. The Rivière, Saint-Pierre and what it left behind. There is still a river flowing under the streets of Montreal. It is not a metaphor. It is not a geological feature from the distant past that left a trace in the rock. It is a river carrying water, moving through a tunnel under the city right now, under the streets of a neighborhood that millions of people visit every year without any knowledge that a living river runs below their feet. The Rivière Saint-Pierre was one of the defining geographical features of the island of Montreal before European settlement. It rose from springs in the western interior of the island and wound through low ground toward the St. Lawrence, entering the larger river somewhere in the area of what is now the Old Port. Its course through the lower part of the island passed directly through the area where Ville Marie would be founded in 1642, making it simultaneously a resource and a problem for the settlement from the very first years. As a resource, the Saint-Pierre provided fresh water close to the settlement, a drainage outlet for the flat ground of the lower town, a small boat access route inland from the St. Lawrence, and a seasonal food supply in the form of eels and other freshwater species that used the river. As a problem, it flooded every spring, contributed to the waterlogging of the lower town soils, and became progressively more contaminated as the settlement grew and its waste disposal practices evolved in the direction that all pre-modern urban waste disposal practices evolved, which is toward the nearest moving water. By 1800, the Saint-Pierre was effectively an open sewer through the western edge of the lower city. Its water was dark with the discharge of a city of 30,000 people's accumulated organic waste. Its banks were lined with the dumped debris of workshops and households. In wet weather, its floodwaters carried contaminated material across the lower portions of the settlement, and the smell of the river in summer was, according to contemporary accounts, detectable at a considerable distance. The culverting of the Saint-Pierre, enclosing it in a stone and brick tunnel beneath the surface of the city, was undertaken in stages between the 1820s and the 1870s. Each stage involved constructing a vault over the river channel, filling over the top, and bringing the surface grade to match the surrounding streets. By the mid-1870s, the Saint-Pierre had disappeared from the surface of the city entirely. The map of Montreal showed no river in the area where it had flowed. The street grid ran across its former course without acknowledgement. But the river did not stop. It simply moved underground. It continued to flow through its culvert, carrying whatever water the springs and drainage of its catchment area produced, discharging into the St. Lawrence through the culvert outlet somewhere in the Old Port area. In some seasons, with heavy rainfall or snowmelt, it carries a significant volume of water. In dry summers, it runs low, but it does not stop. The flow continues. The river demonstrated the permanence of this arrangement in 2004, when flooding associated with the flow of the Saint-Pierre through its culvert infiltrated the Peel Street station of the Montreal Metro and caused significant damage to subway infrastructure. The event made the news and required emergency engineering response. It also reminded a city that had spent 130 years forgetting it, had a buried river that the river had not forgotten it was there. The original bed of the Saint-Pierre, the channel it cut through the natural soil of the island, over thousands of years before European contact, lies somewhere beneath the culvert. River channels accumulate sediment in their beds over time, organic material and silt, and the biological debris of the aquatic environment that creates an archive of environmental history. Pollen preserved in river sediment can tell you what the surrounding landscape looked like at different periods. Diatoms, microscopic algae with silica skeletons that preserve in sediment, can indicate water quality and environmental conditions. Larger organic material, seeds, bone, charred wood, can provide radiocarbon dates and evidence of human activity in the river's catchment. None of this sediment archive has been systematically sampled beneath the culvert and the modern street surface. The engineering records of the culvert's construction tell you what the builders encountered when they opened the river channel. They do not tell you what the sediment column below the channel contained, because the culvert builders were not archaeologists and had no reason to record that information. The original bed of the Saint-Pierre is an unexamined environmental archive running under the streets of one of Canada's most historically significant neighborhoods. Number 7. The wall that Montreal forgot it built. Between 1717 and 1744, the French colonial administration of New France constructed a stone fortification wall around the settled area of Montreal. It was a serious military installation by the standards of the period, approximately 3,400 feet in total circuit, built of local gray limestone to a height of roughly 18 feet above the contemporary ground level, with wall sections 4 to 5 feet thick and bastions at regular intervals to provide flanking fire along the wall faces. 4 gates controlled movement in and out of the fortified town. The whole system represented a substantial investment of colonial resources designed to last and to function. It lasted 60 years as an active military installation. The British conquest of New France in 1759 and 1760 made the Montreal fortifications immediately and permanently obsolete as a defensive structure. The city was now inside the British Empire rather than on its frontier, and a wall designed to resist French colonial rivals and indigenous military forces had no strategic function in the new political reality. For the next 4 decades, the wall served as an administrative boundary, a legal definition of the town's limits, and a customs point. They were not maintained as military infrastructure. In 1804, the government of Lower Canada authorized the demolition of the Montreal walls. The rationale was practical. The walls occupied land that was becoming valuable for commercial development as the city expanded. They impeded the extension of streets beyond the old colonial boundary. Their maintenance, as non-functional masonry, was a fiscal burden with no corresponding benefit. The stone from their demolition was a useful building material. The demolition was carried out over the following 2 decades, wall section by wall section. Contractors hired for the purpose removed the above-ground courses of dressed limestone, which were easily salvageable and marketable as building material, and sold them into the Montreal construction market. By the late 1820s, the visible above-ground portions of the fortification system had been eliminated across most of the circuit. The gates were gone. The bastions were leveled. The wall line was replaced by new streets laid across its former position. What the demolition contractors did not remove were the foundations. Below the 1804 ground surface, the wall continued. The lower courses of the fortification wall, embedded in the earth to depths of 3 to 6 feet below the contemporary surface, were left in place because excavating and removing them would have cost more in labor than the stone recovered was worth. The foundations stayed where they had been built, beneath the new streets and new buildings that replaced the walls. The raising project then buried them further. As the lower city raised its street level through the first 3/4 of the 19th century, fill material was spread over the former wall line along with everything else, adding 10 to 12 feet of new surface above the 18th century ground level. The wall foundations, which had been 3 to 6 feet below the surface in 1804, were now 15 to 18 feet below the surface of the raised streets. The archaeological confirmation of the buried wall has come from construction investigations at multiple locations around the former wall circuit. When deep excavations have been required along the known line of the fortifications, gray limestone masonry has appeared at depths consistent with the historical records of the wall's construction. In some locations, the stone is still well coursed, the mortar between the blocks in reasonable condition, the construction quality of the original work visible in the regularity of the facing stones. In others, water infiltration and freeze-thaw cycling over 2 centuries have loosened the joints, though the stone itself remains. The wall is there. No systematic excavation of the Montreal fortification wall has been carried out as a primary archaeological project. What has been found in the course of other work: construction mitigation, utility trenching, building foundation investigations. The wall as a complete system, its construction sequence, its modifications over 60 years of use, the archaeology of its gates and its guard structures, and its maintenance history is unknown from the physical record. It is the most substantial piece of military colonial architecture in the buried city, and it has never been seriously investigated. Number 8. The Cholera Ground. There is a section of ground in Old Montreal where, in the summer of 1832, bodies were buried faster than they could be individually memorialized. The cholera epidemic of that year killed somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 people in Montreal in a period of approximately 4 months, beginning in June and tapering by October. In a city of 35,000 people, this represented a mortality of roughly 5 to 6%. 1 person in 20 dead in a single season. The geography of death in Montreal during the 1832 cholera outbreak was not random. The disease moved through the population in a pattern that reflected the physical structure of the city, concentrating in the low-lying, poorly drained streets of the lower town, where the flooding of the Saint Pierre River and the St. Lawrence created conditions of persistent dampness and contamination. The areas closest to the water, the neighborhoods where the Irish immigrant poor and the laboring classes of the commercial district lived in crowded and inadequately ventilated conditions, suffered the highest mortality. The elevated areas of the city, where the wealthier residents lived in better constructed and better drained houses, experienced less severe mortality. The miasma theory of disease that prevailed in 1832 attributed cholera to contaminated air arising from rotting organic material and stagnant water. This theory was wrong about the mechanism, which is waterborne transmission through fecal-oral contamination, but accidentally correct in its practical implications. The physical conditions that produced miasmatic air, poor drainage, standing water, accumulation of organic waste near human habitation, were the same conditions that facilitated the contamination of drinking water sources. Cleaning up the miasmatic conditions would, and in Montreal's subsequent history did, reduce cholera transmission, even though the people doing the cleaning did not understand why it worked. The epidemic of 1832 accelerated the political will behind the street-raising project. Before 1832, the case for raising the streets was primarily economic, a merchants' and property owners' complaint about flooding disrupting trade. After 1832, the case became medical. The streets of the lower town were producing conditions that killed people. The response required was exactly the response that the street-raising project was designed to deliver: elevated street grades, improved drainage, reduced flooding, and the elimination of the conditions that produced disease. The second epidemic, the typhus outbreak of 1847, operated through a different physical mechanism but produced similar mortality and similar consequences for the city's infrastructure priorities. The famine Irish immigrants who arrived in Montreal in 1847 came on ships that had already become disease vectors during the Atlantic crossing, and the fever sheds established at Windmill Point near the port were overwhelmed within weeks of the immigration season beginning. The deaths in those sheds of newly arrived immigrants who had survived the crossing only to die within sight of the shore were buried in mass graves. The black rock that marks one of these burial sites still stands in what is now the Griffintown neighborhood. It was placed by the Irish community in the 19th century, a granite boulder with an inscription recording the fact that Irish immigrants died and were buried on this ground. The remains beneath it have never been formally excavated. The full extent of the burial ground associated with the 1847 fever sheds is not precisely known. The cholera and typhus ground of Montreal is not a historical abstraction. There are human remains in the earth of this city from these events, in locations that are not always marked and not always known, associated with mass mortality. Events that happen in the middle of a neighborhood that is now one of the most visited and photographed areas in the country. The streets above them are busy with tourist traffic and restaurant tables and boutique shops. The ground below those streets contains the evidence of how a city deals with mass death, and it has not been fully accounted for. If this kind of history matters to you, leave a comment below. Tell me which part of the buried city of Montreal you would want excavated if you could direct the resources to one location. The conversation in the comments on this kind of video is always worth reading. Number 9. The harbor that moved. The current waterfront of Old Montreal, the stretch of open land along the St. Lawrence that is now the old Port Park, with its cycle paths and seasonal activity vendors and the Science Center at the end of the King Edward Pier, is not where the waterfront of colonial Montreal was. The waterfront moved. It moved outward into the river, pushed by the progressive reclamation of shallow nearshore water into usable land, across the entire history of the city from the 17th century to the present. In 1642, when Maisonneuve's party landed, the shore of the island at this location ran approximately along what is now the line of Rue de la Commune. The land between that line and the current waterfront, the land that is now the old Port Park, was then either very shallow water or a tidal flat that was alternately covered and exposed by the river's seasonal fluctuations. It was not land in any sense that could be built on or settled. It was the edge, the transitional zone where the island met the river. Over the following 3 centuries, this zone was progressively claimed. The mechanisms were several. River silt accumulated in the shallow water near the shore, slowly building up the effective bottom elevation until what had been open water became shallow enough for fill to be placed on top of it. Deliberate infilling, using dredge spoil from harbor maintenance, construction rubble from the lower city, and material excavated for new building foundations, was placed on top of the accumulated silt to create stable ground for wharf infrastructure. The harbor facilities themselves, the timber cribs and stone wharves, and eventually the concrete of the modern port, extended the effective land area further into the river. The result is that the land you walk on in the old Port Park today is, in a meaningful sense, not natural ground at all. It is made ground, reclaimed from the river, over centuries of intentional and unintentional infilling. Below the surface of that made ground, at depths that vary depending on the amount of fill that has been added at each location, is the original harbor floor of colonial Montreal, the surface of the river bottom as it existed in the 17th century. That surface is an extraordinary archaeological resource that has received almost no systematic investigation. The colonial harbor was the single most economically active location in Ville-Marie from the earliest years of the settlement. Every fur pack that left the island for Quebec City or France passed through this harbor. Every supply ship from France discharged its cargo here. Every canoe brigade that came in from the Western Fur Territories landed here. The traffic of 3 centuries of North American commerce moved across this harbor floor. What went into the water at this location across those centuries was not only intentional cargo. Ships in the age of sail shed material constantly. Ballast stones, discharged before loading and sometimes lost overboard during the loading process, lie on the harbor floor. Cargo lost during loading or unloading operations. Boxes and barrels that went over the side settled into the silt. Personal effects of sailors and dock workers lost in the ordinary accidents of waterfront life. The hardware of the ships themselves, anchors dragged across the bottom, mooring chains and rings and bits of iron rigging that fouled and broke. All of this material, deposited over 2.5 centuries of active harbor use, is buried under the reclaimed land of the old port. The ships themselves are there too. Not all the ships that used the Montreal harbor, but some of them. Small vessels that sank at their moorings and were not worth recovering. Vessels abandoned when they were no longer seaworthy, pushed to the edge of the active harbor zone, and left to settle into the silt. The wooden hulls of these vessels, buried in the anaerobic sediment of the harbor bottom, are preserved in conditions that can maintain wood in recognizable condition for centuries. Maritime archaeologists working in comparable harbor environments in Europe and North America have found ships in exactly these conditions, their timbers still solid, their construction details readable, their cargo and fittings sometimes still in place. Nobody has conducted a systematic maritime archaeological survey of the buried harbor floor beneath the old port. The engineering surveys done for infrastructure projects in the area have located some anomalies that might be vessel remains, but no targeted archaeological investigation has followed up on them. The harbor floor of colonial Montreal is sitting there, under the cycle paths and the festival stages and the tourist infrastructure of one of Canada's most visited urban parks, unexamined and undated. Number 10. What the excavators found at Place Royale. In 1979, the city of Montreal undertook infrastructure improvements at Place Royale, the small public square at the edge of the old port that had been the commercial center of the colonial lower town. The project required below-grade work, new drainage, utility upgrades, modifications to the ground surface. Quebec's cultural property legislation, which had come into force in the 1970s, required an archaeological assessment before the work could proceed. Archaeologists put their first test trenches into the square in 1979, and what they found changed the conversation about buried Montreal permanently. The surface of Place Royale today sits at the raised street level, the post-raising project elevation of the lower city. Below the surface, the archaeologists found not the relatively shallow and disturbed deposit that a well-used urban public square might be expected to contain, but a deep, stratified, and in many areas well-preserved sequence of occupation deposits that extended from the current surface to depths of more than 15 feet. 7 distinct occupation layers were identified in the initial investigation, each containing material from a different period of the city's history, each separated from the next by recognizable changes in the character of the deposit. The uppermost layers, from roughly 6 to 8 feet below the modern surface, contain material from the first half of the 19th century. Commercial debris, ceramic fragments in the types produced in English factories for the North American market, glass from bottle forms common in the 1820s and 1830s, iron hardware from building construction of the period. These were the deposits of the colonial period commercial district at the peak of its activity, before the street-raising project began to seal the lower levels. Below these, between 8 and 11 feet, the deposits became French colonial in character. The ceramics shifted from English transfer printed wares to French tin-glazed earthenware, the faience that was the dominant tableware of French colonial households in the 17th and 18th centuries. Pipe bowls in forms characteristic of the French colonial period appeared. Iron hardware in forms that predated the standardization of the British period. The fortification wall rubble appeared in the stratigraphy at its expected depth, the demolition debris of the 1804 clearance mixed with the occupation deposits of the late colonial period. At depths between 11 and 14 feet, the early French colonial period, the oldest permanent buildings of Ville-Marie, foundation stones from structures that appear on no surviving map, but that the archaeological evidence placed in the mid to late 17th century. Floor surfaces with the impressions of wooden planking, preserved as ghost stains in the soil. Cellar features with the remnants of wooden shelving preserved as discolorations in the fill. Artifacts dating to the 1640s through 1680s, some of the oldest European material ever recovered from an urban archaeological context in Canada, and below 14 feet the pre-contact layers, the deposits that existed before any Europeans set foot on the island. The soil in these layers contains stone tools in the lithic tradition of the St. Lawrence Iroquoian cultural complex, the people who occupied the island before and during the period of early European contact. Ceramic sherds from vessels made in Iroquois and pottery traditions, quite different in fabric and form from the French ceramics above them. Fire-cracked rock from ancient hearths, faunal material from species that the Iroquois communities of the island hunted and processed. This material, sitting at the bottom of the Place Royale deposit, predates the founding of Ville Marie by at least a century and possibly by several centuries more. The Place Royale excavation ran in various phases from 1979 into the late 1980s, with successive seasons investigating different portions of the square and the adjacent areas. The material recovered was catalogued and stored in provincial collections facilities. Its analysis produced publications that established the basic framework for understanding the buried history of old Montreal. The site, when the infrastructure work was complete, was reconfigured as a public space, with some below-grade archaeological features preserved and made accessible to visitors through a small museum installation that anticipated the larger Pointe à Callière museum that would be built nearby a decade later. 20% of the Place Royale site was investigated. The other 80% was left in place. Number 11. Reading the layers. To understand what an archaeologist actually does when they excavate a site in Old Montreal, it is useful to think about what they are doing in terms of reading a document rather than digging a hole. The soil of the site is the document. The layers are the sentences. The artifacts within the layers are the words, and the interpretation of the whole is the act of reading, which requires understanding not only the individual elements, but the relationships between them, the sequence in which they were deposited, and the transformations they have undergone in the centuries since they were placed in the ground. The primary organizing principle of archaeological excavation is stratigraphy, the study of how different layers of soil and material relate to each other vertically. The basic law of stratigraphy, established in geology and applied to archaeology, is that in an undisturbed deposit, older layers are at the bottom and younger layers are at the top. This is intuitively obvious because material can only be deposited on top of what already exists, and it is also complicated in practice because urban deposits are rarely undisturbed, and the activities of successive generations of city residents do not respect the sequence that the law of stratigraphy assumes. Building a new foundation cuts through existing layers, creating an intrusion that introduces the material of one period into a context that belongs to an earlier one. Digging a privy pit cuts through the stratigraphy from above, placing the material that fills the pit in contact with older soil at its sides and bottom. A fire event can deposit burned material over a wide area, mixing the debris of the fire with the surface on which it fell. The filling of the raised streets incorporated material from across the city's history, mixing it into a deposit that bears no direct relationship to the original context of any of its constituent artifacts. The archaeologist's job is to identify these intrusions and disturbances and account for them in the interpretation. When an excavation reveals a layer of mixed material that contains artifacts from different periods, the archaeologist must determine whether this represents a genuine occupation, deposit from a specific period, or a disturbed context where material from different periods has been mixed by later activity. This determination is made through careful observation of the soil matrix, the physical characteristics of the soil that contains the artifacts, and through the spatial and depth relationships of the artifacts to one another and to the surrounding stratigraphy. In Old Montreal, the most common form of stratigraphic disturbance is the infilling of former cellar spaces. When a building with a cellar was demolished and the site was prepared for a new building, or simply abandoned and covered with fill, the cellar cavity was filled with whatever material was available. This fill, often included construction rubble from the demolished building, refuse from the surrounding area, and material specifically brought in to level the surface. The result is a deposit within the cellar cavity that may contain material from multiple periods, all of it having arrived through the infiling process rather than through the sequential deposition that would produce a meaningful stratigraphic sequence. The archaeologist working in Old Montreal must also contend with the complications introduced by the raising project itself. The fill layers associated with the raising are typically identifiable by their character. They tend to be coarser and less well sorted than natural or undisturbed occupation deposits, with a higher proportion of rubble and imported gravel than would be expected in a deposit formed by the ordinary accumulation of daily life. But identifying the lower boundary of the raising fill, the point where it meets the older occupation deposits beneath it, can be difficult in areas where the fill was placed directly on an existing surface without a clean break in the soil matrix. When the boundary is found, when the excavation breaks through the base of the raising fill and enters the intact colonial period deposits below, the character of the material changes in ways that are immediately apparent to an experienced excavator. The soil becomes darker, richer in organic material, less sorted. Artifacts appear in greater density and in forms that are more diagnostic of specific periods. The spatial patterning of artifacts, which in the fill above is random or near random, begins to show the kind of structured distribution that reflects use patterns and activity areas within actual built spaces. The archaeologist is, at this point, reading the city as it was actually lived in, rather than the debris of its later clearance and modification. It is slow work. A square meter of complex urban stratigraphy can take days to excavate properly. A site of meaningful size requires seasons of field work. The analysis of the recovered material takes years after the field work ends, and the reporting and publication of the results, the step that converts the physical investigation into historical knowledge that others can access and build on, takes additional years beyond that. The buried city does not give up its information quickly. Number 12, the Pointe-à-Callière Museum. In 1992, Montreal opened a museum built directly over an archaeological site, designed so that visitors could descend into the excavated levels of the colonial city and stand in the actual physical spaces that the excavation had uncovered. The Pointe-à-Callière Museum of Archaeology and History is not a museum that contains artifacts removed from their context and placed in cases, though it does that as well. It is, in its most important dimension, a museum built inside the archaeological site itself. The building that houses the museum was designed by the architect Dan Hanganu in a triangular form that sits on the footprint of the former Royal Insurance Building, incorporating its surviving masonry into the new structure. The above-ground portion of the museum is notable architecture for Montreal, but the below-ground portion is what makes the museum significant in the context of this video. The museum's underground level opens directly onto the excavated deposits of the Pointe-à-Callière site, the tip of the peninsula where the Rivière Saint-Pierre met the St. Lawrence, the location of some of the earliest and most historically significant features of the colonial city. The great archaeological crypt that runs through the underground level of the museum follows the buried course of the Saint-Pierre, and the walls of this long underground space expose sections of the site's stratigraphy behind protective glass panels. You can stand in the museum's underground level and look at the actual layers of deposit from the colonial occupation, fire horizons, and building foundations and occupation debris, as they exist in the undisturbed profile of the excavation face. The in situ features preserved in the museum's underground level include portions of the earliest European building foundations found at this location dating to the mid-17th century, visible under transparent protective flooring. The actual stone of those foundations is there, the mortar between the courses, in the condition it has been in since it was laid by someone who was building Ville Marie in the 1640s or 1650s, 400 years ago. Walking above those foundations, looking down through the floor at the actual material of the founding generation, is an experience that is qualitatively different from looking at an artifact in a case or an image in a textbook. The museum opened in 1992 as part of Montreal's 350th anniversary celebrations. Its intellectual driving force was Francine Lelièvre, an archaeologist who had been involved in the Place Royale excavations of the late 1970s and who became the museum's founding director. Her conviction was that the most powerful way to convey the buried history of the city was not to remove the physical evidence from the ground and display it in conventional museum contexts, but to bring the audience to the evidence in place. In the context of Canadian museum practice in 1992, this was a genuinely innovative institutional form. The museum has continued to expand since its opening, adding underground connections to adjacent properties and incorporating newly excavated sections of the former fortification wall into its visitor circuit. In 2013, a major expansion created an underground passage following the line of the buried fortification walls that connected the original building to the neighboring Yuval Stables complex, adding significant new archaeological material to the visitor experience. Even with 2 decades of expansion, the Pointe-à-Callière Museum has excavated only a fraction of the site on which it sits and the sites adjacent to it. The museum provides a window into the buried city. The window is extraordinary. The city behind the window extends in every direction, vastly larger than anything visible through the glass. Number 13. The objects that time kept. The things that survive in the ground are not the things that people intended to preserve. They are not the objects that were valued most, or the documents that were considered most important, or the structures that were built to last. They are the things that fell through the cracks, literally and figuratively, the objects that were lost before they could be recovered, the material that ended up in the ground through accident or abandonment, rather than through deliberate disposal. This has a specific implication for what the archaeological record of old Montreal can and cannot tell us. The grand furniture of the colonial elite, the silver plate and the silk clothing, and the fine ceramic dinner services that marked wealth and status in the colonial city, is mostly not in the ground. The wealthy residents of Ville Marie did not drop their silver into cellar pits. They passed it on, sold it, melted it down, moved it with them when they relocated. The objects that the colonial record treats as significant, the objects that appear in inventories and wills and merchant accounts, are largely absent from the archaeological record precisely because they were valuable enough to be kept and transferred rather than lost or abandoned. What is in the ground is what had no further use at the moment it entered the ground. The ceramics that were broken beyond repair and thrown into the midden, the shoes that wore out completely and were left in a cellar when the building above was sealed, the tobacco pipe that cracked in use and was dropped into the corner of a room, the food scraps that accumulated on the floor of a workshop and were swept into a pile that was never carried away, the iron nails that fell from a roof frame being repaired and settled into the mud of the street below. This is the mundane and accidental archaeology of daily life, and it is far more abundant and in some ways more informative than the intentionally preserved and intentionally significant objects of the documentary record. The ceramics of colonial Montreal are the best studied class of artifact from the buried deposits of old Montreal, both because they are among the most abundant materials found in excavations and because the ceramic traditions of 17th and 18th century France and Britain are well enough understood by specialists to allow precise identification of forms, production centers, and date ranges. French tin-glazed earthenware, the faience that was the standard tableware of middle-class and elite households in the French colonial period, was produced at a number of centers in France, principally in Rouen, Nevers, Moustier, and Saint-Cloud, and each production center had characteristic styles that specialists can identify in fragmentary sherds. A rim fragment of Rouen faience found in a Montreal cellar deposit establishes a connection to a specific manufacturing tradition in a specific French city, and if the stylistic features of the fragment are precisely datable, the fragment can anchor the deposit in time to a range of perhaps 20 or 30 years. The organic material is more fragile and more revealing. In the waterlogged deposits associated with the former course of the Saint Pierre River and the harbor zone, and in the sealed cellar deposits where moisture levels have been consistently high and oxygen has been excluded, organic material that would normally decay completely in the soil is preserved in a leathery or compressed but physically intact condition. Leather shoes from the 17th century are the most dramatic of these finds, not because shoes are intrinsically significant, but because a shoe is an object made to fit an individual human foot, worn by an individual human body over time, and its physical characteristics carry information about that body in the form of wear patterns and size. A 17th century leather shoe found in an old Montreal excavation is physical contact with a specific person, long dead and probably unnamed in any surviving document, who walked the streets of Ville-Marie. Wooden objects in waterlogged deposits are similarly informative. Barrel staves with cooper's marks that can be traced to specific craftsmen or workshops in French ports. Wooden handles from iron tools, the iron corroded to scale, but the handle preserved in the anaerobic soil, still showing the compression and polish from the hand that gripped it. Bowls and platters from the household equipment of the colonial period, turned on a lathe in forms that reflect the vernacular woodworking traditions of the French regions that the colonists came from. Plant material from waterlogged deposits offers a different kind of evidence. Seeds preserved in the organic sediment of old Montreal's lower deposits can tell you what was being eaten, what was being grown, and what the broader ecology of the island looked like during the colonial period. Wheat and rye from bread grains imported from France, maize from the indigenous agricultural traditions that colonists encountered and partially adopted, seeds of local wild plants that were gathered and consumed, grape seeds from wine production or wine consumption, medicinal herb seeds from the gardens of the religious institutions that were major landholders in the colonial city. The botanical record of what people ate and what grew around them is embedded in the soil of old Montreal in considerable detail, and it has barely been read. Number 14. What the workers keep hitting. The conversation between the present city and its buried past is not a conversation that happens only in formal archaeological contexts. It happens every time a backhoe opens a new trench in old Montreal for a utility upgrade or a building underpinning project. It happens in the basements of restaurants whose owners discover, in the course of renovation work, that the wall they thought was original to the building is actually built against an earlier wall that belongs to a structure 3 or 4 construction generations older. It happens on construction sites where the engineer's report said the ground was clean and the first day of excavation produced a stone-vaulted cellar that has been sealed since 1840. Quebec's cultural property legislation requires that construction projects that encounter archaeological material stop work and notify provincial authorities. The requirement has been in place since the 1970s and has teeth. Projects that knowingly destroy archaeological material without notification face significant penalties. The legislation has unquestionably prevented the loss of material that would otherwise have disappeared into a construction truck without documentation. But legislation is only as effective as its application, and the application depends on a chain of decisions made by people who are under deadline pressure and financial constraint at each link. The construction worker who hits a stone wall has to recognize it as archaeologically significant rather than simply old rubble. The foreman has to decide that stopping work and calling a number is worth the cost of the delay. The contractor has to accept that the schedule they committed to will not be met. These decisions are not always made correctly. What does get documented, because it is too obvious and too dramatic to ignore, forms a record of incidental discovery that runs across decades of construction activity in Old Montreal. In the 1980s, construction work on the western edge of Old Montreal broke through the ceiling of a sealed 18th century cellar and entered a space that had been closed since the street raising project sealed it. The cellar was intact. Artifacts were on the floor. The walls showed the scorching of the fire that had preceded the demolition of the building above. Archaeologists were called, the material was documented, and the construction project was modified to avoid destroying the most significant features. Similar discoveries have been made in other locations across the decades. A sealed privy pit from the early 19th century, filled after it went out of use and covered by the raising fill, produces an anaerobic deposit containing ceramic, glass, organic food waste, and personal items that gives a snapshot of one household's material life in a specific decade. A building foundation encountered during the excavation for a new underground parking structure proves to be the foundation of a structure shown on a map from 1760, its stone still coursed and mortar bonded, its plan matching the historical cartographic record with a precision that bridges the gap between the documentary and the physical evidence. Each of these finds is significant. Each of them is also partial. The documentation produced during construction mitigation is typically less thorough than what a dedicated archaeological project would produce, because the time pressure of an active construction schedule does not allow for the slow, careful recording that the material deserves. Material is recovered and removed, not because anyone wants to destroy it, but because there is no mechanism for leaving it in place when a building needs a foundation poured in the exact location where the archaeological feature sits. The workers who make these discoveries are occasionally quoted in the local press, and their descriptions of the experience are remarkably consistent across decades and across different types of finds. Surprise. A physical disorientation at the gap between the surface city they are working in and the buried city they have just broken into. A sense, sometimes described and sometimes not, of the strangeness of entering a space that has been completely sealed from the human world for longer than anyone living can remember, and finding it waiting exactly as it was left. Number 15. The technology of seeing underground. The archaeologists who first excavated Place Royale in 1979 worked without the ability to see what was in the ground before they broke the surface. Their method was to put a spade in and find out, extending the excavation in the directions and to the depths that the material warranted, stopping when the material stopped being informative. This approach produced extraordinary results and remains the basis of all archaeological field work. But it has an obvious limitation. You can only learn what is in a place by disturbing the place. The technology available to archaeologists working in Old Montreal today allows a different kind of preliminary investigation. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses of electromagnetic energy into the soil and records the reflections that return from subsurface features. Different materials reflect the pulses at different rates and with different characteristics. A stone wall buried in clay soil produces a distinct reflection pattern. A void space, an empty cellar or a sealed tunnel, produces a different pattern still. A change in soil type, from the porous and rubble-rich fill of the raising project to the denser and more organically rich occupation deposits below, can produce a detectable reflection at the boundary between the two. The results of ground-penetrating radar surveys in Old Montreal, conducted in connection with specific development projects and specific research programs over the past 2 decades, are significant. In areas where the historical cartographic record suggests the presence of buried building foundations, the radar images show linear anomalies at the depths and orientations predicted by the historical maps. In areas where the raising project should have created a clear boundary between fill and earlier deposits, that boundary appears in the radar data at depths consistent with the historical record of when the raising occurred and how much fill was added in each area. The radar images also show things that the historical maps do not predict. Void spaces at depths where no documented cellar should be. Linear features that run at angles inconsistent with the known property boundaries of the colonial period, suggesting the presence of buildings or structures that predate the period for which the documentary record is complete. Areas where the subsurface is more disturbed than the surrounding material, indicating prior excavation or construction activity that was not recorded. The radar is not only confirming what the historical record says is there, it is finding things the historical record does not mention. Magnetometry is a complementary approach that detects anomalies in the local magnetic field caused by the presence of buried iron objects or fired features such as kilns, hearths, and burning events. In a colonial city with centuries of occupation, iron objects are ubiquitous in the buried deposits, and fired features are common in any area used for cooking, smithing, or ceramic production. A magnetometry survey of an area of Old Montreal would be expected to produce a dense and complex pattern of anomalies reflecting the layered activity of multiple centuries of occupation. The challenge is interpreting which anomalies correspond to which periods and which types of features. These technologies are not magic. They do not show you what is in the ground in the way that excavation shows you. They show you patterns in the physical properties of the subsurface that may or may not correspond to archaeological features, and distinguishing the meaningful patterns from the noise requires the kind of interpretive expertise that only archaeologists with deep knowledge of the specific site and its history can provide. A radar anomaly that looks like a void space might be a sealed cellar full of extraordinary material. It might also be a pocket of loose soil formed by a decayed tree root. You cannot know which it is without excavating. But the technology changes the economics of investigation. Instead of excavating an entire area to find out what is there, a researcher can conduct a non-destructive survey, identify the most promising targets, and direct the expensive and time-consuming process of excavation toward the specific locations most likely to produce significant results. This allows a more efficient use of the limited resources available for archaeological investigation in Old Montreal, and it reduces the possibility of missing significant features because the excavation was not directed toward the right location. The systematic application of these technologies across the entire area of Old Montreal has not yet been done. Individual surveys have been conducted in specific areas for specific projects. A comprehensive, publicly available geophysical atlas of the buried city does not exist. Creating one would be a substantial undertaking, requiring coordinated survey work across properties owned by different individuals and institutions, processed and interpreted by specialists working within an agreed methodological framework. It would also be one of the most significant steps that could be taken toward understanding what is below the streets before development projects make sections of it inaccessible permanently. Number 16, the underground city. Nobody designed. There is a feature of Montreal that is celebrated in tourist literature as an example of modern urban planning ingenuity, a carefully designed response to the realities of a city with severe winters. The RESO network, the underground pedestrian system that connects shopping centers, office towers, hotels, and transit stations across central Montreal is often described as the largest underground pedestrian network in the world. It is presented as a planned infrastructure achievement, the product of visionary urban design. It was not planned. It grew one connection at a time, over 60 years, driven by individual commercial decisions rather than any comprehensive vision of what the whole system should be. The first connection in what would become the RESO was built in 1962, when the developers of Place Ville-Marie, the new cruciform office tower then under construction in central Montreal, negotiated a connection between their building's underground level and the central station beneath it. This connection was not made because anyone had designed an underground city. It was made because it added commercial value to the retail space in Place Ville-Marie's underground concourse by connecting it directly to the rail terminal through which tens of thousands of commuters moved daily. The metro system, which opened in 1966, extended the network's reach by creating underground stations that were connected to adjacent buildings through underground passages, negotiated by individual property owners seeking access to transit adjacent commercial traffic. Each new connection was made through a separate negotiation between the Metro Authority and an adjacent property owner. Each negotiated connection added to the network without reference to any master plan for the whole, because no master plan existed. The result, after 6 decades of incremental growth, is a system of 33 kilometers of underground passages connecting over 300 buildings. It functions well and is genuinely useful, but its existence as an underground city beneath central Montreal has an implication for the buried colonial city beneath Old Montreal that is worth considering. The RESO construction cut through the subsurface of central Montreal at depths that, in the older parts of the network, passed through material from the early and mid-19th century. The excavations for metro stations cut deeper, in some cases to depths that would have reached material from the late 18th century in areas of the city with long occupation histories. What was found in those excavations, and whether it was documented before the tunnel borings and station excavations proceeded, is unevenly recorded in the historical literature of the metro's construction. What the RSO demonstrates, in a different way than the colonial city below it, is the city's consistent relationship with its underground spaces across its entire history. The colonial period created an underground of sealed cellars, buried foundations, and covered rivers. The industrial period created an underground of sewers and utility tunnels. The late 20th century created an underground of pedestrian concourses and transit infrastructure. Each layer was created without full knowledge of what the layers below it contained. Each layer partially overwrote what was already there. The result is a vertical sequence of urban underground history that extends from the modern RESO concourses down through the 19th century infrastructure and into the colonial deposits, and eventually to the pre-contact indigenous occupation of the ground itself. The relationship between these different underground cities, the commercial, the infrastructural, the archaeological, and the pre-contact, has never been mapped in any comprehensive way. Each has its own literature and its own institutional stewardship. The RESO has detailed engineering records maintained by the city's infrastructure department. The colonial deposits have archaeological records maintained by provincial cultural property authorities. The pre-contact material is the responsibility of indigenous cultural heritage agencies and academic institutions. None of these records has been fully integrated with the others into a single coherent account of what is below the surface of Montreal across all periods and all depths. Number 17, 80%. The estimate appears in multiple publications on the archaeology of Old Montreal, in heritage assessment reports, in academic papers, in the documentation produced by provincial cultural property authorities. Approximately 80% of the archaeological resource beneath the lower city has never been investigated. Not partially investigated, not investigated and then disturbed by later construction. Never touched, never opened. The first shovel has not yet gone into the ground in 4/5 of the area that contains the buried colonial city of Montreal. This statistic requires some clarification because it is an estimate rather than a precise measurement. Nobody has ever dug a systematic grid of test pits across all of Old Montreal and counted what percentage of them contain intact archaeological material. The estimate is instead derived from the known locations of archaeological investigations that have occurred, combined with an assessment of the character of the subsurface in areas where no investigation has taken place. Some of the uninvestigated areas may prove to be more disturbed than the investigated areas, their deposits damaged by deep construction in the 20th century. Others may be better preserved. Without investigation, you cannot know. What can be identified with reasonable confidence from the historical and documentary record and from the results of the investigations that have occurred are the areas that are most likely to contain significant unexcavated material. The residential and commercial blocks of the lower town between Rue Notre Dame and Rue Saint-Paul, the two main east-west streets of the colonial city, contain beneath their existing stone buildings the accumulated deposits of 3 centuries of continuous urban occupation. Every property in this zone has been built over repeatedly, but the deep investigations that have occurred in some of these properties have consistently found intact colonial period material below the levels reached by ordinary construction. The properties that have not been deeply investigated, which is most of them, almost certainly contain comparable material. The area of the former marketplace at Place d'Armes and the adjacent streets was the political and institutional center of the colonial city. The Hôtel Dieu Hospital, the first hospital in the city and among the most important institutions of the colonial period, was located in this area. The earliest churches and public buildings of Ville Marie were in this zone. The archaeological deposits associated with these institutions, the refuse deposits, the building sequences, the burials associated with the religious institutions, have not been systematically investigated. The line of the fortification walls is, in its full circuit of 3,400 feet, largely unexcavated. Individual sections have been encountered in construction investigations. The Pointe à Calière Museum has incorporated some sections into its underground visitor circuit, but the wall, as a complete archaeological object with its construction history, its modification over time, and the archaeology of its operational features such as gates and guard structures, has never been the subject of a comprehensive investigation. The pre-contact layers, the deposits that predate European settlement entirely, are the least known of all the buried resources. Every excavation that has gone to depth in Old Montreal has found pre-contact material at the bottom of the colonial sequence. The character of that material, the duration of pre-contact occupation at this specific location, and the relationship between the buried pre-contact deposits and the historical accounts of the Iroquoian village of Hochelaga, which was located somewhere on the island of Montreal in the 16th century, is essentially unknown. The dendrochronological analysis of wood from Old Montreal excavations represents another avenue of investigation that has been applied in only a limited number of cases. When a piece of wood with a sufficient number of growth rings is recovered from a sealed deposit, the ring pattern can be matched against established reference chronologies for the tree species in question. If a match is found, the wood can be dated to the year it was cut. Not the decade, not the century, the year. A beam from a colonial period building, dated by dendrochronology, to a specific year in the 1650s or 1670s or 1710s can be connected to specific documented events in the city's history with a precision that transforms the interpretation of the site. Montreal, in the mid-17th century, is a period that is well documented in the archives, and a construction date obtained from the wood of a building foundation can be compared directly to the building records and the property transactions of the period to identify who built the structure and for what purpose. This level of resolution in the physical evidence is unusual in urban archaeology and represents an opportunity that has been realized in only a small number of old Montreal excavations. The waterlogged deposits that preserve wood in recoverable condition are present across much of the lower town area. The dendrochronological reference chronologies for the species used in colonial Montreal construction are well established. The methodology is available. The application of it at sufficient scale to produce a dated sequence of construction events across the buried city has not been done. The 80% figure is a measure of how much work has not been done. It is not a criticism of the archaeologists and heritage professionals who have worked in Old Montreal. They have done remarkable work within severe constraints of funding and site access and institutional support. It is simply a statement about the scale of the resource relative to the scale of the investigation that has been possible. 4 centuries of urban archaeology in one of the oldest and most historically significant settlements in North America, and the first shovel has not yet entered 4/5 of it. Number 18, the last customs house and the merchant records. Among the specific categories of buried material in Old Montreal that have received significant but incomplete investigation, the zone around the old customs house on Place Royale deserves particular attention for what it represents in the history of the city's economic life and what it likely contains below its current surface. The old customs house, completed in 1837 to designs by the architect John Austell, is the neoclassical building that faces the old port from the north edge of Place Royale. It was built to serve as the primary customs facility for the Port of Montreal, the administrative point through which the commercial traffic of the river and its trading networks passed and was taxed. In the 1830s and 1840s, when the building was new, Montreal was the busiest port in British North America, handling the fur trade output of the Western Territories, the timber export of the Ottawa River Valley, the wheat production of the expanding agricultural settlements upstream, and the import traffic of a rapidly growing colonial city. The ground on which the customs house was built is layered with the physical evidence of several centuries of commercial activity at this location. Before the customs house, there was a succession of earlier commercial and administrative structures at the same address, each built over the remains of its predecessor, each generation adding to the depth of the buried deposit. The site sits at the former harbor edge, adjacent to the area where the Rivière Saint-Pierre discharged into the St. Lawrence, at the location where the first commercial transactions of the colonial city were conducted. Below the customs house foundations, at depths that construction investigations have not fully reached, are the deposits associated with the earliest commercial infrastructure of Ville-Marie. The fur trade that drove the founding and early growth of the settlement was physically concentrated at the river edge near this location. The canoe brigades from the Western Territories arrived here. The trade goods sent up from France and Quebec City to supply the inland trade were stored in warehouses at this location. The packing and weighing and recording of fur packs before they were loaded onto ships for the journey down the St. Lawrence was done in facilities that occupied the ground directly below the current customs house. The archaeological deposits associated with these activities, the refuse from the storage and processing of furs, the hardware from the canoes and the warehouse buildings, the personal effects of the fur traders who worked this ground, the ceramic and glass and organic material from the households that occupied the adjacent properties, is sitting below the customs house at depths that no excavation has yet reached in a systematic way. The construction investigations associated with the building's maintenance and modification have encountered colonial period material at the edges of the dig areas, enough to confirm that intact deposits are present, not enough to characterize them in any comprehensive way. The customs house is a heritage-designated building, which protects it from the kind of development that would require a full archaeological investigation before new construction could proceed. This protection is appropriate for the building itself. It does not, however, address the question of what is below the building and when, if ever, that material will be systematically investigated. A heritage designation that protects the building above ground while leaving the archaeological resource below it, unexamined and unprotected from future events, is a partial solution to the problem of preserving the historical record of this location. The merchant records of colonial Montreal, the accounts and inventories and correspondence that document the commercial life of the fur trade economy, survive in fragmentary form in archives in Montreal, Quebec City, Paris, and London. They tell one version of the economic story of the colonial city. The physical record of the commercial infrastructure, the built environment, and the material culture of the fur trade, as it was actually practiced on the ground, tells another version. The two versions need to be read together. Reading the physical version requires excavating the ground beneath the customs house. That excavation has not been done. Number 19. Where did the people of Hochelaga go? Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence in October 1535 and found a village. The village was substantial by any measure, palisaded, with perhaps 50 longhouses arranged around a central open area surrounded by fields of corn and other cultivated crops. Cartier estimated the population at 1,000 or more. He named the mountain above the village Mont Royal, and the name stuck even after everything else about this place changed beyond recognition. He was received with ceremony and fed and entertained and given information about the geography of the river system upstream, information that he imperfectly understood and recorded more imperfectly still. He left after a day. He called the village Hochelaga. The people who lived there, the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, used a different name for it, but Cartier did not record that name accurately or perhaps at all. The village of Hochelaga appears in his account as a specific, functioning, populous place on the island in the St. Lawrence that he called Hochelaga as well, using the same name for the settlement and the island both. When Samuel de Champlain came to the island in 1611, 76 years after Cartier's visit, there was no village. There was no settlement of any kind. The island was unoccupied by any permanent community, visited by indigenous traders using it as a waypoint on the river system, but not inhabited. Champlain made no reference to finding any remnant of the community that Cartier had described. The St. Lawrence Iroquoians, the people of Hochelaga, had gone. In the 76 years between Cartier's visit and Champlain's, one of the largest indigenous communities in the St. Lawrence Valley disappeared entirely from the landscape. The documentary record of what happened is essentially non-existent because the period between 1543 and roughly 1600 is one of the poorest documented intervals in the European exploration of North America. The French interest in the St. Lawrence Valley waned after Cartier's voyages failed to produce the gold and the passage to Asia that were the primary motivations of the enterprise, and no sustained European presence was maintained in the area during the decades when the St. Lawrence Iroquoians were disappearing. The explanations that scholars have advanced for this disappearance are several and not mutually exclusive. European epidemic diseases, transmitted through indirect contact networks before sustained European presence in the area, may have caused catastrophic mortality in a population with no immune history of these pathogens. Warfare with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to the south and southwest, which the historical record suggests was a persistent feature of the political landscape of the eastern Great Lakes region, in the 16th century may have driven the St. Lawrence Iroquoians from their settlements. The disruption of traditional trade networks by European commercial activity in the broader region may have made the densely settled agricultural communities of the St. Lawrence Valley economically unsustainable, or some combination of these factors may have operated together in a sequence and with interactions that the sparse historical record cannot reconstruct. None of these explanations can be evaluated with confidence on the basis of the documentary record alone. The physical evidence, the archaeology of the places where the St. Lawrence Iroquoians lived and worked and died, is the only potential source of information that could allow scholars to test these hypotheses against physical reality rather than document-based inference. The site of Hochelaga itself has never been conclusively identified. The most widely accepted location, based on the route Cartier described from his landing place to the village, and on the topographical features he mentioned, places the village somewhere in the area of the current McGill University campus or the adjacent residential neighborhoods of west central Montreal. The McGill campus has been heavily developed since the university was established in the 19th century, and the opportunities for comprehensive archaeological investigation have not been created. What has been found in scattered investigations across the island is evidence of St. Lawrence Iroquoian occupation at multiple locations. Ceramic sherds in the characteristic Iroquoian styles, cord impressed and collar decorated, quite distinct from both the European ceramics of the colonial period and from the ceramic traditions of other indigenous cultural groups in the region. Stone tools in lithic traditions associated with Iroquoian communities. Fire-cracked rock from cooking features. These finds confirm that the island was occupied by the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, that the occupation was substantial, and that it is archaeologically recoverable in at least some locations. They do not locate Hochelaga. Below the streets of Old Montreal, below the colonial occupation layers, below the fire horizons and the building foundations and the street-raising fill, there may be deposits from the Iroquoian occupation of this specific part of the island. The confluence of the Saint Pierre and the St. Lawrence was a resource-rich location, likely attractive to indigenous communities for the same reasons it was attractive to European settlers. The excavations that have gone deep enough at Place Royale and the Pointe-à-Calière site have found pre-contact material. The extent and character of that material, and whether it connects to the community of Hochelaga that Cartier visited, is not known. The question of what happened to the people of Hochelaga is the most significant unresolved question in the history of this place. It is larger than any question about colonial architecture or 19th century engineering. It is a question about the fate of thousands of people who lived on this island for centuries before the first European arrived, who received a French explorer with hospitality in 1535, and who were gone 76 years later without leaving any account of what had happened to them that has survived in any form that can currently be read. The physical record of their presence is in the ground below Old Montreal. The ground has not yet been asked. Number 20. The city that does not know what it is sitting on. Montreal is a city of intense self-awareness about its own history. The debates about language and culture and political identity that have defined Quebec public life for the past 60 years have given the city's residents a particular sensitivity to questions of historical continuity and cultural inheritance. The cobblestones of historic Old Montreal, the stone buildings of Rue Saint-Paul, the name of the Rue Saint-Pierre and the Rue de la Commune, and the Rue Notre-Dame, all of these carry a weight of historical association that most Canadian cities' street grids do not. People in Montreal know they are in an old place. What they do not generally know is how old the place is below the surface, and what the below-surface history means for the above-surface city they are walking through. The heritage value of Old Montreal is framed almost entirely in terms of the surviving above-ground built fabric, the stone buildings of the 18th and 19th centuries, the street layout that preserves the pattern of the colonial period town, the churches, and public buildings that give the neighborhood its architectural character. The buried city, the 12 feet of sealed urban deposit below the cobblestones, is largely invisible in the heritage conversation. This is not primarily a failure of public awareness. It is a structural feature of how heritage is categorized and managed in the Quebec institutional context, where built heritage and archaeological heritage are administered under different frameworks, funded through different streams, and communicated to the public through different institutions. The Pointe à Calière Museum has made enormous strides in bridging this gap, but a single institution, however excellent, cannot compensate for a systemic separation between the two aspects of a city's historical identity. The consequence of this separation is that decisions about what to build, where to build it, and how deep to dig are routinely made without a comprehensive understanding of what is in the ground at the affected location. Development projects in Old Montreal are subject to archaeological assessment requirements, but assessment is not the same as investigation, and the assessment process is designed to identify significant material and determine mitigation requirements, rather than to produce a comprehensive understanding of the buried resource before the development proceeds. Material is found, documented to the extent that time and budget allow, removed if removal is necessary for the development to proceed, and the development proceeds. The buried city is being consumed, incrementally and incompletely documented, at the pace of the development cycle. Some of what is consumed is irreplaceable. The sealed cellar that is destroyed to allow a foundation to be poured will not be replaced by anything. The privy pit that is cut through by a utility trench without documentation is gone. The pre-contact deposit that is removed without sampling is gone. The physical record of 3.5 centuries of urban life and several thousand years of pre-contact occupation does not have a backup copy. What is not investigated before it is destroyed is simply not known. The organic residue analysis of ceramic vessels from old Montreal deposits is a relatively recent addition to the archaeologist's toolkit that has produced results in other colonial contexts that are directly relevant to the questions the buried city of Montreal raises. When a ceramic vessel is used to store or prepare food, organic material from the contents is absorbed into the porous fabric of the vessel wall. This material survives, in many cases, for centuries, preserved in the ceramic matrix against the chemical degradation that would destroy the same material in the open soil. Chemical analysis of the ceramic fabric can identify what was stored or prepared in the vessel, detecting the specific molecular signatures of fats, oils, proteins, resins, and other organic compounds that were in contact with the vessel during its use. A pot that was used for fish oil leaves a different chemical signature than one that was used for tallow or lard or plant oils. A vessel that held alcohol leaves a signature different from one that held water or vinegar. The analysis of these residues, applied to the large ceramic assemblages already recovered from old Montreal excavations and to future assemblages from sites yet to be excavated, would allow researchers to reconstruct the dietary and commercial practices of the colonial city from the physical evidence of the vessels themselves, supplementing and in some cases correcting the picture provided by the documentary record. The argument for treating the buried city of Old Montreal as a primary heritage resource, worthy of systematic investigation rather than incidental documentation, is not an argument against development or urban renewal or the living city's right to grow and change. It is an argument that the investment required to understand what is below the surface, before the surface is opened and the material below it is committed to a particular fate, is worth making. The technology to see underground non-destructively exists. The methodological frameworks to excavate and analyze what is found exist. The scholarly expertise to interpret the results exists. What does not exist, consistently and at sufficient scale, is the institutional commitment and the public funding to apply these capabilities to the problem before the development cycle removes the opportunity. The streets of Montreal were raised 12 feet. The city above the raising is visible and celebrated and extensively documented. The city below the raising is largely invisible, largely unknown, and largely unprotected. It will not remain unaffected by the city above it indefinitely. The window for systematic investigation is open. It will not stay open forever. The relationship between the documentary record of colonial Montreal and the physical record preserved in the buried deposits is not one of simple correspondence. The archives tell one version of the city's history, the ground tells another, and the two versions do not always agree. Property records show a building on a specific lot from a specific date, but the archaeological evidence shows construction activity on that lot a generation earlier, suggesting an earlier building that was demolished and not recorded in the surviving documents. A merchant's inventory lists specific categories of goods stored in a warehouse, but the archaeological deposit in the warehouse's former cellar contains categories of goods not mentioned in the inventory, goods perhaps that were not declared for customs purposes or that were considered too minor to record. The ground is not simply an illustration of the written history, it is a different kind of evidence with different strengths and different gaps, and the comparison between the two produces insights that neither source would produce alone. This complementarity is one of the strongest arguments for prioritizing the archaeological investigation of Old Montreal. The documentary record of the colonial period, while substantial by the standards of 17th and 18th century North American documentation, has significant gaps and biases. It records the activities of the literate and the officially recognized. It underrepresents women, indigenous people, enslaved individuals, laboring class residents, and the majority of people whose lives did not generate the kind of administrative paper trail that survives in archives. The archaeological record, by contrast, is the residue of everyone's material existence without distinction. The household refuse of the wealthiest merchant and the humblest laborer are equally present in the ground, equally recoverable by excavation, equally informative about the physical conditions of life in the colonial city. Number 21. The ground that commerce made. The commercial geography of colonial Montreal is, in a sense, the buried city's organizing principle. Every major archaeological feature of the lower town, every building foundation and warehouse cellar and harbor structure and fortification gate connects ultimately to the economics of the fur trade and the Atlantic commercial networks that made the city possible and shaped the form it took. Understanding the buried city means understanding what the fur trade actually looked like on the ground, in physical terms, as a material enterprise conducted by human beings in specific buildings with specific tools and specific daily routines. The fur trade of the St. Lawrence Valley in the 17th and 18th centuries operated through a network of exchange relationships that connected indigenous trappers and hunters in the continental interior to European merchants in Montreal, Quebec City, and the ports of France and Britain. At the Montreal end of this network, the trade was conducted through a combination of formal commercial infrastructure, licensed trading posts, warehouses and counting houses, and informal exchange. The direct barter between indigenous traders and Montreal merchants that occurred during the seasonal trade gatherings known as the fur fairs. The fur fairs were among the most economically significant events in the annual cycle of colonial Montreal. Indigenous trading parties, primarily Algonquian-speaking peoples from the north and west, arrived by canoe at the Montreal landing place with the winter's fur harvest, primarily beaver pelts destined for the European hat-making industry. Montreal merchants met them with goods acquired from France and Britain, cloth and metal tools and firearms and alcohol and ceramic goods, and traded them for the furs. The exchange was conducted at the riverfront and in the open spaces of the lower town, a convergence of two economic worlds that was the economic foundation of the entire colonial enterprise. The physical infrastructure of this trade is what the buried deposits of old Montreal represent in their most commercially significant dimension. The warehouses where the trade goods were stored before the fair, the weighing and packing stations where the acquired furs were processed for shipment, the counting houses where the accounts were kept and the transactions recorded, the dock facilities where the canoes were landed and the goods were loaded and unloaded. All of this infrastructure occupied the lower town and left physical traces in the earth that have been found in excavation and that remain, in the majority of the area, unexcavated. One of the most consistent archaeological finds in the lower town excavations that have occurred is hardware associated with fur processing. Metal tools, particularly the large bladed tools used for stretching and scraping pelts, appear regularly in deposits associated with the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The frames on which pelts were stretched for drying, made of wooden poles lashed with sinew or cord, are gone, the organic material having decayed, but the ground disturbances associated with the stake holes that supported them are visible in the soil as dark cylindrical features in photographs of open excavation areas. The trade goods themselves, the items that the Montreal merchants offered to indigenous trading partners in exchange for furs, appear in archaeological contexts both in the lower town and in indigenous sites throughout the northeastern part of the continent. Glass trade beads, a commodity that moved from Venetian and Dutch manufacturers through Montreal and into the continental interior in enormous quantities, are found throughout the colonial period deposits of old Montreal. Copper and brass items made in European workshops and traded into indigenous communities appear with similar consistency. The material culture of the fur trade economy, the physical substance of the exchange relationships that drove the founding and early growth of Montreal, is recoverable from the ground of the lower town in quantities and conditions that would allow a detailed physical reconstruction of how the trade actually operated. That reconstruction has not been attempted at the scale the resource would support. Individual excavations have found individual features associated with the trade. No comprehensive study of the material culture of the Montreal fur trade has been built from a systematic investigation of the buried deposits of the lower town. The warehouse districts, the dock areas, the transaction zones of the seasonal fur fairs are sitting in the earth below the current surface of old Montreal in a state of preservation that decreases incrementally with each year that passes and each development project that opens the ground without full archaeological investigation. The preservation conditions in old Montreal's buried deposits vary significantly across the area, and this variation is one of the factors that makes the planning of archaeological investigations complex. The highest preservation conditions are found in the areas closest to the former course of the Rivière Saint-Pierre and the harbor zone, where the water table has maintained consistently high moisture levels in the soil. In these zones, organic material, particularly wood, leather, and textile, can be in remarkable condition after 3 centuries in the ground. The lowest preservation conditions are found in areas where the soil is well drained and oxidizing, where organic material has been destroyed by the same processes that would destroy it at the surface. In between these extremes, the majority of the buried deposit occupies conditions of intermediate preservation, where bone and ceramic and glass and metal survive well. But organic material is present only in the most robust forms, carbonized plant material and dense leather, rather than in the more delicate wood and textile that appear in the waterlogged zones. Knowing the preservation conditions in advance of excavation allows archaeologists to calibrate their recovery strategies appropriately. An excavation in a waterlogged zone requires different sampling protocols, different environmental controls on the processing of recovered material, different conservation infrastructure, and different analytical approaches than an excavation in a well-drained zone. The failure to anticipate and plan for waterlogged conditions can result in the loss of organic material that would have survived the excavation process if handled correctly. Waterlogged wood and leather that are allowed to dry without controlled treatment will shrink and crack, and in some cases disintegrate completely within hours of being exposed to the air, destroying material that had been preserved for 3 centuries. Number 22. The properties that kept their secrets. Not every property in Old Montreal has been investigated to any depth. In fact, the majority have not been investigated at all below the levels reached by routine maintenance and renovation work. The buildings of the lower town, most of them constructed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries on the foundations of earlier structures, have basements that extend to depths of perhaps 6 to 8 feet below the current ground surface, reaching down into the fill of the raising project, and sometimes, in the older buildings, into the upper portions of the colonial period deposits immediately below the fill. Below the basement floors of these buildings, sealed under the foundation slabs and the compacted subgrade fill that leveled the ground before the foundations were poured, the older deposits continue. The owners of these buildings are not, in general, aware of this. The existence of an archaeological resource below the basement floor of a commercial building in Old Montreal is not the kind of information that typically appears in property transactions or in the consciousness of building owners managing their properties for commercial purposes. A restaurant owner in Old Montreal knows that the building is old, knows that the stone walls are attractive to their clientele, and probably knows approximately when the building was constructed from the heritage designation materials. They almost certainly do not know that 12 feet below their wine cellar floor is a sealed colonial period space containing the operational debris of whatever commercial activity occupied this ground in the 17th century. The basement spaces of Old Montreal's commercial buildings occupy in aggregate a significant fraction of the floor area of the lower town. Most of them have never been investigated below their current floor level. Some of them have been modified repeatedly in the past century for various commercial purposes, their walls waterproofed with cement, their floors leveled with concrete, their HVAC and plumbing and electrical systems running through the older fabric in ways that have disturbed the immediate subsurface without reaching the older material below. These modifications are, from an archaeological perspective, a mixed legacy. The concrete floors and the utility trenches have disturbed the upper portion of the colonial period deposit in some areas. They have also, in many cases, acted as a cap that has protected the deeper material from further disturbance. There are buildings in Old Montreal whose basements have not been systematically entered, let alone archaeologically investigated, in living memory. There are party walls between adjacent properties that have been in place since the 18th century and have never been opened to see what is behind them. There are former doorways that were sealed when buildings were reconfigured and have not been opened since. The urban fabric of Old Montreal is, at its margins and in its interior spaces, deeply conservative of the historical situations it was built to contain. What is behind the sealed doorways and below the concrete basement floors and within the spaces between party walls is, in the current state of knowledge, unknown. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of individual properties have suggested the presence of subsurface voids and structural anomalies at depths consistent with sealed colonial period features. The radar images are suggestive but not definitive. Confirmation requires excavation. Excavation requires the cooperation of property owners, heritage authority approvals, archaeological expertise, and funding. None of these requirements is easily met in the context of an active commercial district, where the primary interests of the stakeholders are in keeping the district functioning and the buildings operational. The tension between the living city and the buried city is not resolvable in absolute terms. The living city has legitimate needs that the buried city cannot accommodate. Development will continue. Buildings will be modified and in some cases demolished. Ground will be opened for utilities and foundations. The question is not whether these activities will occur, but whether they will occur with a commitment to understanding what is below the ground before it is irrevocably altered. The properties that have kept their secrets longest are not, in most cases, the properties that have been most neglected. They are often the properties that have been most consistently used, whose basements have been continuously occupied for commercial purposes since the 19th century, whose owners have had every practical reason to avoid the disruption and expense of deep investigation. The secret is kept not by intention, but by the ordinary priorities of a working commercial neighborhood. The city above keeps moving. The city below waits. Outro. The next time you walk the cobblestones of old Montreal, you are walking above a buried city that is, in most of its extent, completely unknown. Below your feet, at depths between 10 and 15 feet, depending on where you stand, is the surface that the people of Ville Marie walked on in 1660. Below that surface are the cellars they dug, the waste they generated, the objects they lost and abandoned and could not retrieve. Below those cellars, at depths of 14 to 18 feet, are the pre-contact deposits of the people who lived on this island for thousands of years before any European arrived. And somewhere in those deposits, below the colonial city and below the centuries of accumulated urban material, may be the physical evidence of what happened to the people of Hochelaga, the 1,000-strong community that Cartier visited in 1535 and that had vanished from the earth before any European returned. 80% of this has never been touched. 80% of the buried history of one of Canada's oldest and most historically significant urban sites is sitting in the dark below the most visited neighborhood in the country, waiting for someone to look. That waiting is not indefinite. The buried city is not a stable condition. It is a condition in gradual decline, diminished by every development project that opens the ground without full archaeological investigation, by every decade that passes with the chemistry of the buried soil slowly working on organic material that survived 300 years waiting for someone to read it. The central question is not whether the buried city will eventually be fully known. It is whether enough of it will actually survive long enough for the full investigation to be done. That waiting is not indefinite. Development projects, utility upgrades, building renovations, the ordinary metabolic activity of a living city are consuming the buried deposit incrementally. Each project that opens the ground without full archaeological investigation removes material that cannot be recovered. Each generation that passes without systematic investigation of what is below old Montreal is a generation that has deferred a responsibility that becomes harder to discharge as time and development reduce what remains. The city above the ground is celebrated. The city below the ground deserves to be known. If this video reached you, subscribe. New investigations of buried places and forgotten histories go up regularly. Leave a comment telling me what you think the most important unexcavated site in Canada is. The answer you give and the reason you give it tells you something about what you think history is for.